We're fortunate indeed in having a very distinguished gentleman here to act as moderator this morning. Colonel Dall is a very distinguished Washingtonian now, living there and is head of Liberty Lobby, directing their activities there, and doing a great deal of talking hither and yon across the country and back. I heard him speak about a month ago at the dinner of the Order of Lafayette, where I think he amazed some of the people in the audience by what he had to tell them, but I'm sure it was good for them. And he has also achieved a good deal of fame by his book on FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, which gives a candid camera view of much of the life of FDR and his family, and is a tremendous help to a lot of us in getting people to realize what has been going on in the last 40 years. So it's a great pleasure to have him here to serve as moderator this morning, and here is Colonel Curtis Dall.
Ladies and gentlemen, and fellow American patriots, I'm highly honored this morning to present to you shortly a very distinguished and patriotic American who has made a great contribution to our knowledge of perhaps the most important factor of the enemy's penetration into our Western civilization. May I say briefly, in analyzing the strength of this matter, we can go back to the Bible and recall that the love of money is the root of all evil. Along with the love of money, ladies and gentlemen, goes the nefarious and often secretive organizations in our Western civilization that for several hundred years have used the vast power of money to control, directly and indirectly, the various parliaments and monarchies of the Western world. It's the combination of the love of money and its political puppets that are the root cause of our vast dislocations today, and which are the major factors of the somber confrontation which we have to make if we want to be realistic. Their organizations have been perfected, they have been well financed, and they have been most secretive. Recall this phrase, that the policy of the monarch, I'll put it this way, it's better. The policy of the monarch is the policy of his creditors. Now, of course, in the United States of America, we don't owe any money to anybody, hardly any. Just about 400 billion to start with. So therefore, it does not take much of an analysis to realize what our chief executive, I could name names, but in Liberty Lobby we are nonpartisan, we are the people's lobby. So I will simply say that our chief executive, in my opinion, represents little more, ladies and gentlemen, than a puppet for large one world international money and he has to do, just like his predecessor had to do, the will of the vast money powers. Now, where do we come in? We, the casually referred to taxpayers? Well, we come in last. We are the people who have to pay the freight. And so I mention these few words to you to point out the vast importance of our distinguished speaker, who I will now proceed to introduce to you. By dint of hard work, she has been awarded a master's degree in finance at Northwestern University. Upon completing her distinguished record there, she went to work for an important bank in Chicago, the Northern Trust Company, and from 1922 to 1930, she occupied a very important position in its councils, particularly in the Department of Money and Money Policy and Investment Advice. She came into this area of money fortified with broad experience in two areas, one of which she was very familiar with the problems of many American farmers. Our speaker has had vast experience in two strands of her background. One, that she is very familiar with what took place in the commodity depression of 1920 to 22, when hundreds of thousands of our fine, prosperous American farmers were duly despoiled of their property by a deliberately conceived plan to break the commodity market fostered by the Federal Reserve Bank system. That was their great initial contribution to aid the farmers, which they said that they were going to do when they had their puppet Woodrow Wilson put the bill through Congress and saddle a debt financing system on the backs of all of us in this room, which will go down to our children and our children's children unless we change it. So our speaker is very familiar with what happened in the Farm Belt by the money pirates in 1920 to 1922. She also is very experienced in the world of big money. And with that combination, I am going to say that I know a few people who back in 1933, when she wrote this fabulous book, The Money Creators, that she was way out in front of anybody that I knew at that time. Now today it is 1971. Lots of water has gone under the bridge, but that water carries the prophecies of this great lady. It is with the greatest of pleasure and the highest of esteem that I present to you Miss Gertrude Coogan, the author of The Money Creators, from Chicago, a great patriot.
Colonel Dall, Colonel Bunker, and Mrs. McKinney, ladies and gentlemen and friends. I'm going to talk about the economic power that has brought us to the state, the misuse of it that has brought us to the state that we are today. But first of all, I want to refer briefly to something that's happened in Chicago that is indicative of what we're headed for. On August the 15th, 1967, at the Chicago Civic Center, amid pomp and ceremony, a Picasso, an object of great art or a monstrosity, as many have dubbed it, was unveiled. What did it depict? What did it mean to those responsible for its origin and placement at that prominent place? Who paid for it? Then and since, the Chicago papers have carried many letters asking the purpose and the meaning guessing, ridiculing, and stating what it seemed to mean. Out of curiosity, on Dedication Day, that was August the 15th, 1967, I phoned the Chicago Tribune and was referred to a person associated with that firm responsible for its creation. That person asked if I had ever seen the Washington Monument at the capital of our nation. I had. What is its shape? I replied, an obelisk. That was his only clue. An obelisk is a square shaft with a pyramidal top, usually monumental. Egyptian obelisks are always monolithic and slightly tapering, as is the Washington Monument. From there, I reread The Dawn of Conscience, written in 1933 by the late Dr. James Henry Breasted, a world-famous archaeologist and Orientalist. On the pyramidal tomb, this is according to Breasted, on the pyramidal tomb was a solar system of the highest sacredness, rising above the mortal remains of the king to greet the sun, S-U-N that is, sun, whose offspring the pharaoh was. In other words, according to Egyptian thinking of God, that he was the son of the sun that shines in the heavens. The sun god was accustomed to manifest himself in the form of a phoenix, a sacred bird fabled as coming every 500 years out of Arabia to Heliopolis, where it burned itself on the altar and rose again from its ashes, young and beautiful, hence an emblem of immortality. The king was buried under the symbol of the sun god, that's S-U-N, which stood in the Holy of Holies in the temple at Heliopolis. On the apex of the pyramid, at the base of Amenhotep III, a pyramid of Dall on the side which faced the east, we find a winged sun disk surmounting a pair of eyes, beneath which are the words, the beauty of the sun, the eyes indicating the eyes of beholding. You see the same thing in this Picasso. If you're in Chicago, when you go by the Civic Center, you will see this. Now, all public demonstrations now or celebrations are held at this spot in Chicago. Another illustration by Breasted is entitled Under the Shadow of Thy Wings. In a temple relief at Luxor, we see the sun god as a falcon hovering with wings protectingly outspread over the last great king of the Egyptian Empire, Ramesses III. We have seen the same solar falcon hovering above the head of King Khafre over 16 centuries earlier as a figure of divine protection. The shadow of their wings occurs 4 times in the Hebrew Psalms. I quote Breasted. The fundamental conclusions that form the basis of moral convictions and continue to do so in civilized life at the present day had already been reached in Egyptian life long before the Hebrews began their social experience in Palestine, and those Egyptian moral convictions had been available in written form in Palestine for centuries before the Hebrews arrived there. The surviving documents demonstrate historically that the thing which was long called the moral consciousness of mankind had grown out of the disciplines and emotions of family life, supplemented by reflection and teaching of experienced elders. The supreme values which lie within the human soul have therefore, as a matter of historical fact, entered the world for the first time through those gentle and ennobling influences which touch us continually in our family life. They were not anywhere upon this globe until the life of father, mother, and children created them. It was the sunshine and atmosphere of the earliest human homes that created the ideals of conduct and revealed the beauty of self-forgetfulness. In the foreword of The Dawn of Conscience, Breasted says, like most lads among my boyhood associates, I might intersperse this for a minute. Breasted was born over at Rockford, Illinois, so he was a native of Illinois. He's buried at Rockford, Illinois. I learned the 10 Commandments. I was assured they came down from the skies into the hands of Moses. I remember that whenever I fibbed, I found consolation in the fact that there was no commandment, thou shalt not lie, that the Decalogue forbade only a false witness giving testimony where it might damage one's neighbors. I began to be troubled by the fact that a code of morals which did not forbid lying seemed imperfect. I had more disquieting experiences when, as a young Orientalist, I found that the Egyptians had possessed a standard of morals far superior to the Decalogue over 1,000 years before the Decalogue was written. Breasted had dedicated half a century to the origins of moral and ethical codes when he wrote this paragraph in the final pages of his last book in 1933, quoting Breasted, "The life of man has become a struggle between the new ideals of self-forgetfulness that arose but yesterday and the deep-seated passion for power, which is as old as the human race itself, and has thus far been so dangerously victorious over the newborn conscience and character that we are faced with the grave question of the survival of civilization." That's written by a man who had spent 50 years as one of the most recognized students of archaeology and Orientalism. His record has never been duplicated to this day. Yet that is what he saw in 33 as the outcome of the struggle, the power struggle that was then obvious to him. I mentioned the interpretation and the purpose of this Picasso, recently erected in Chicago, to ask, does it depict a return to a God as part of nature? The sun God, I mean S-U-N God, a part of nature and the source of physical energy, a symbol of materialism. In other words, abandon the triune God, God the Creator, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God who created man, Christ to redeem man, and the Holy Spirit who guides man. In other words, in this great city of Chicago, in the most prominent place possible, is erected a Picasso indicating that we're abandoning the belief in the triune God, erecting a symbolism that's strictly materialism. Is the purpose to eliminate and replace the Christian concept, the Christian triune God, the Father who created the world and man, and Christ to redeem man, and one is salvation, and the Holy Spirit who guides man. In the cathedral at Cefalu on the north coast of Sicily, which was built under the first Norman kings in the early crusading days, there is placed over the half-dome of the apse a great mosaic representing Christ in judgment. Under it along the border runs in mosaic also a motto which follows, "Having made man, I, the maker of man, and the redeemer of what I made, judge. Having myself a body, the bodies and souls of men, for I am God." That's taken from The Crisis of Civilization, written in 1937 by Hilaire Belloc, who was then giving a series of lectures at Fordham University. This is the complete doctrine of what I just quoted from Belloc. This is the complete doctrine of the incarnation. Thus, the Picasso in Chicago depicts materialism as represented by the sun god, S-U-N. This means that mere man is to play the role of God, and the civilization which recognized the true dignity of God, of man, as made to the image and likeness of God, is to be replaced by atheistic communism. Now, our government, the founders of America established a republic. Under a republic, the power of government is vested in the citizen, but is delegated and exercised by representatives of the people. The specific powers our representatives receive from us, the citizens, are granted to them in our Constitution and its amendments. A word artfully and deceptively used in this country is democracy. Democracy means rule by direct action of the people. Our Constitution did not provide for a democracy, and real democracies have ever produced nothing but chaos and slavery. They have always turned into mobocracies. Vicious slogans have blurred the diversities of mankind in an unreal abstraction called humanity. The slogan in World War I was to make the world safe for democracy. The treaties imposed after World War I all speak the language of democracy, but impose the regulations of imperialism. They pretend to ordain in terms of exclusive national sovereignty, reciprocal non-national economic relationships. This is raw deception. What is nationality? A society of men and women with customs, habits, speech, culture, history, and traditions attached to places, times, and circumstances. To make the world safe for democracy demands an international order and a single law. Over the past 60 years, in particular since the New Deal, both control over men and control over nature has been the goal of persons misdirecting and undermining the American system of free, competitive enterprise and the whole Christian background of the nation, the United States of America. Avarice and selfishness are often dominant in human characteristics, and unless carefully guarded against, will prevail. If avarice, so manifest in human nature, is not to overcome man's superior qualities, control, that is, ownership over the basic resources of the earth, must be widely distributed and held in private hands. Therefore, to protect society against the misuse of power, economic and political, it must be within the power and the right of every citizen to own, use, and control honestly acquired private property. The power of human to control the physical resources of the earth breeds untold evils. Power breeds arrogance, and arrogance corrupteth the understanding heart. Power over the means of livelihood, when held by a government or by a few entities, always destroys the rights of the individual and enslaves the governed. A citizenry that permits the government to encroach upon the rights of private property and impose its dictates upon its economic life is committing itself to slavery, subjects of arbitrary rulers. In the structure of the American economy, that is a study made under the auspices of the United States, in which Congress, the money was appropriated by Congress. The title of this study was The Structure of the American Economy, a study published by the National Resources Committee in 1939, paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. The bureaucrats admitted exactly what they mean by the term controls, C-O-N-T-R-O-L-S, controls. Quote, this is quoted from that study. Because the term controls involves a relatively new concept, that is, economic concept, it is important to give it the greatest possible clarity. It is here used to refer to the ability of one individual or group to influence the policies in respect to the use of resources which are owned by another individual or another group. A second and more significant reason for using the term controls rather than the term power is the dynamic implications of the former. Power is solely a term of position, whereas control is a term of both position and action. A person can have power, that is, be in a position of power. Likewise, a person can have controls, that is, be in a position of control. But only in the case of control is it possible to say that a person controls, referring thereby to the dynamic process of influencing the policies adopted by others. The verb to control thus corresponds to the phrase to exercise power. That's taken from the Structure of the American Economy, page 153. In defining controls, the bureaucrats made clear that control is not necessarily associated with ownership. In other words, bureaucrats can control the use of a farm, a house, a home, a factory, or a merchandising enterprise and derive most of the fruits from it, but still not own it. In short, the control the bureaucrats mean is power to force others to take whatever action the bureaucrats want them to take. Bureaucrats force others to injure themselves, not always in the sense of using physical force or intimidation, but instead often by slyly prearranging surrounding circumstances and or causing crises so as to leave no apparent constructive alternative. The choice then offered by the bureaucrats is not between good and evil, the constructive or the destructive, but it is so arranged that choice is confined solely between two evils. Both evils are disguised as benefits until their intended victims are baited and entrapped. By analyzing and correlating all the knowledge gained and the operating facts concerning all industries and enterprises, the bureaucrats knew exactly what to do to gain for themselves strategic control over all essential phases of every economic and even religious enterprises in the United States. Although the bureaucrats' alleged purpose was to know and remove injurious effects of concentration of economic power, the then well-informed economic doctors knew exactly how to kill the American competitive free enterprise system. Killing, not curing, is what they were intending to do. For public consumption, the bureaucrats shouted, private monopolies, restraint of trade, cartels, antiquated, like the pickpockets who yell fire while they quickly lift the billfolds from the pockets of the stampeding victims. The 78th Congress, in Senate Resolution 102, created a special committee for post-war economic planning and policy. This committee was to evolve a program of dynamic democracy. The important fact to note is that the bill, sponsored by Senator George, which implemented Resolution 102, created an Office of Demobilization whose director was, quote, subject only to the general direction and control of the President. In other words, Congress was handing over all control. This meant Congress would have no power beyond that of suggestion. The director and his associates became absolute economic dictators. By March of 1944, the bureaucrats and their stooges had started a campaign to condition the American taxpayers' minds to an overall federal debt of $400 to $500 billion. That's back in 44. The plans were laid, and they knew then what they were shooting at in the way of an overall federal debt. They've now reached the 400 billion level. They've already authorized up to 425, but apparently, according to their own designs, they've got another up to 500 billion before they figure they've gotten everything they want in the way of powers and controls. Through the so-called Demobilization Act, they sought to extend their controls over all economic enterprises after the World War II shooting stopped, and they did. Not only did they gain control over the American economic system, but they have arranged to charge the USA taxpayer countless billions to keep American men fighting and laboring to rebuild Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, etc., etc. And the Cold War still goes on. You see the purpose of the Cold War? To make the American man do the work, the American taxpayer pay the bill to rebuild all those parts of the world. In other words, the real reason we're in Vietnam all these years is two. First, to destroy the culture that Vietnam had. Vietnam had a high development of Christian culture. Destroy that. Secondly, make the American man, fighter, taxpayer, highly skilled man, pay the cost in physical labor and in the money cost of modernizing that part of the world with highways, wharfs, docks, hospitals, anything that was needed for the later development of that part of the world when the communists moved in and took over. And the reason for going on and on and on with this Cold War was that they were still working feverishly to build these installations and to keep the Americans there under the guise of stopping communism, when what was actually going on was laying the groundwork for the communists to move in with all the facilities laid for a modernized nation, modernized use of the natural resources. What they're seeking is the control over the natural resources of that part of the world. But of course, they have to have some development to be able to use them efficiently. So we pay for them in blood and treasure. A worldwide, wait a minute. Not only did they control over the the goal of the internationalists imposing dynamic democracy. Now that was the purpose of this legislation, Senate Resolution 102. Dynamic democracy. Well, now you know what dynamic democracy means as imposed worldwide. A worldwide dictatorship with themselves in absolute control, but with so-called managers as fronts, operating a totalitarian economic system in every country. Call it communism or socialism, whichever you prefer. Either label is correct. Managers are chosen partly from drafted and enlisted armed forces. All minor bureaucrats are chosen and trained not because of intelligence, integrity, and ability, but rather because not knowing how or desiring to run a particular business or institution efficiently, they willingly take orders. They do exactly as told by the super bureaucrats. These young and inexperienced government-trained managers are characterized chiefly by unbounded egoism and insolence. They have a type of mind the super bureaucrats conditioned to be totally subservient bootlicks. These so-called managers are permanent fronts for the internationalists. These super bureaucrats and managers are now imposing the dictates of the internationalists upon every phase of American life, upon the educational system. Education has become psychosocial, as the editor of Catholic Currents in the recent April 30th issue stated. The central change in the nature of education in this decade, the shift from education designed to impart at least the most rudimentary intellectual skills to education which is freely intended to instruct, not to instruct, it's intended not to instruct, but to indoctrinate and control. In other words, we are making zombies of our young. Our established Christian educational system is being undermined at all levels, preschool, grade school, college, and university. The means used are sex education, sensitivity training, group dynamics, phony psychological counseling, and in plain terms, total brainwashing, all designed and promoted to destroy the young and deny their parents exercise of their God-given right to know and control what is being taught to their own children. This is the generation gap in practice. The ecumenical movement is surreptitiously designed by super bureaucrats to undermine the application and practice of Christian principles by both Protestants and Roman Catholics. They aim to destroy the teaching and practice of the King James Version of the Protestant Bible and to substitute so-called social action as the goal of organized Protestantism. In the Roman Catholic Church, the traditional liturgy, which implemented the Orthodox doctrine, has been changed. The Eucharistic meal has replaced the sacrifice of the Mass, which is the renewal of the crucifixion of Christ on Calvary. Not only has the liturgy been changed, but a frontal attack has been made on the authority of the popes and the bishops and other teachers and administrators of Catholicism. In other words, the doctrines of the mystical body of Christ and the structure, that is the magisterium, is being destroyed and replaced by democracy and social action instead of seeking and earning the graces available through the worthy reception of the sacraments. We hear this is the age of Aquarius. Occultism, Pentecostalism, Satanism, pornography, immodest and freakish dress, drugs, etc., are widely promoted among the young and the old and older persons. Further frontal attacks are being made on the Christian family by pushing birth control and abortions, as well as easy divorce. We learn from Breasted that the beginnings of civilization are in the family, yet we're being led into destroying the family. Well, if you destroy the family, you have no civilization left. There's nothing left. And yet, in this country today, these frontal attacks are being made. Such a thing as this being erected in the city of Chicago. And people are left unaware of what is really happening to them and what is the ultimate outcome of what is going on in every big city in the United States today. The United States court system is being destroyed by substituting and applying administrative law instead of constitutional law. Meanwhile, tax-free foundations and countless bureaucracies with billions of tax money support riots, turmoil, and thievery of all kinds. Under the label of ecology, the sovereign powers of the 50 states are being replaced by a metro government, that is, regional bureaucracies designed to force the surrender of the individual citizen of his rights and the states of their rights. This ecology program should be labeled the bamboozle program. Now we return. How was our country conquered? How were they able to put this over to the stage that we reach today? We'll return to basic economic principles. Wealth is physical. It's natural resources converted by man into food, clothing, shelter, and all the things necessary for life. That is the correct definition of wealth. That product of work or energy which empowers and sustains life. The Creator provided abundant natural resources. These resources of energy are eternal and ever recurring. Man endowed with intelligence has discovered how to use these resources to supply his daily recurring needs. And if there ever was a country blessed with wonderful resources, natural resources, it was the United States of America. Using raw materials existing in the natural resources, man is daily doing the following. First, he's making available goods and things in forms adapted to be used up directly in living. Second, he's building new tools and machines and repairing and rehabilitating the ones previously completed and in use. At the same time, he's consuming, that is, the goods and things to sustain and empower his life. And he's wearing out and abandoning obsolete tools, machines, and buildings. Now, that's a constant process. Innovation of tools and machines, the substitution of mechanical power for animate power, that is, man's physical energy, practically eliminated direct use of goods and things by the persons who worked on them. Each member of a family or a group became a separate worker on a single thing which he could not personally use up. As work was subdivided and specialized, the individual became dependent upon being able to exchange his goods or work for that of others. The individual worker on a single product or a part of one had to acquire for his personal uses many varieties of goods and things produced by others. The individual who had first given up his time, his knowledge, his skill, his diligence, and work to make available what others needed or wanted was paid a receipt. That receipt entitled him to claim upon demand for his own use goods and things made available by others. That receipt is called money. If you just think of the simple proposition of how you get honestly acquired money, you first give up yourself, your knowledge, your skill, your time, and at the end of a certain period, you get what is actually a receipt for what you've already given up and delivered. You hold that to suit your convenience, and then go and claim from the society the food, clothing, shelter, or services that you want. You're simply getting what you previously had earned. That is, all money that's acquired honestly. That receipt was called money. Creators of money would have us believe that they took over creation on the 8th day with the fiat, "Let there be money." And lo, there was money. No one accepted these receipts for receipts as such. He gave up his knowledge or work or something he already owned for receipts only because the receipts entitled him to claim upon demand what he chose for his personal needs and uses. By giving up the receipts, that is the money, he could draw upon the totality of all the goods for sale within the nation. That constituted the function of money when money was first used as a means of exchange. That still constitutes the true function of money performs for the individual in a society today, whether the individual is a member of a small community or a citizen of a mighty nation. It has the same identical function. For receipts to function, that is, money to be used in a nation, all persons must be willing to accept receipts and be owed goods and things. As long as you've got money in your possession, either in your pocket or on deposit at a bank, you are willingly going without what the money would get for you if you gave it up and took the ownership of the physical thing that you wanted in exchange. Now, it's the very fact that everybody at all times who's working and has an income has a certain amount of money on hand in the bank or carrying it around in his purse. He's voluntarily going without that much worth of the goods and things to which he's entitled. When you give up the money, go to spend it for something, a home or something you want, or food or clothing, the other fellow takes the role that you then had. Do you get that concept? Now, whoever has the right to originate this thing that you accept as a receipt, he's in a position to control the whole society. And you have to work for money, but he gets the money by creating it himself. See his position of power? Now, to whom does that power belong? It belongs only to the sovereign power of all the people. And in whom is that vested? The Congress of the United States. The only power that should have the power to originate money, that is to put it out at the source of where it originates, should be the Congress of the United States. And it should be issued interest-free at the point of origin. In other words, paid into circulation in lieu of taxing the people for every service the government needs, and paid into circulation in such volume as is necessary to keep the whole economy a going concern. In other words, if you've got natural resources and you've got trained people, men capable of using those natural resources, the first thing they have to do is, if they're going to use them effectively, is build tools and machines. And after they have tools and machines, they have to keep modernizing them and keeping them in work. So you see, the concept of money, if you get it correctly, is that everybody uses money who has an income. And it's your willingness to accept money and use it keep it until you need something yourself. And everybody does that. That concept of all the money that's in the pockets of the people or on the books of the banks at the moment is what is owed physically, what physical things are owed to the possessors of money. And you just keep changing with the other fellow all the time. That's what Professor Frederick Sodde, in his magnificent work called Wealth, Virtual Death, he called that virtual wealth. In other words, the wealth that you're voluntarily going without. Now, wealth, as I be sure to recall, is that product of work or energy which enables or empowers life. It's physical. Don't think of the word wealth in terms of some bond you own. It's not. It's a physical reality you're referring to. The confusion of terms is one of the reasons why few people do not understand the real function of money and what is the matter with the money system that we now have. The owners of receipts are voluntarily going without goods and things they could have by surrendering their receipts, that is their money. When owners of receipts give them up, they then have the goods and things instead of the receipts. The validity of a receipt derives from the fact that its possessor in acquiring it gave up an equivalent of what he may claim by giving up that receipt. For example, the workman gave up hours of labor, the manufacturer gave up his goods, the owner of a house, the land, tools, machines gave up the use of them, and so on. Interest and dividend, interest and dividend. Interest is only the return you get for having loaned your genuine savings, genuine earnings, to somebody else to buy a house or build a factory or something else. And dividends are only your return for having paid for the tools and machines in use. That's what it is if the thing is properly set up. There's only two payments in the whole economic system, if you understand it. One is wages for work, and the other is wages for the use of tools. It comes either to you in the form of interest on a mortgage or dividends in the way of, and that's all there is. If you boil the economic system down, there's only two terms: wages for work, wages for the use of physical realities, houses, tools, machines, or whatever it is. That's interest and dividends. If you think of those in those simple concepts, you gain an understanding of why this power is so overwhelming. The power to issue the receipts in the first place, you can only get them by working, but somebody has to issue them in the first place. Who issues them and how? And then the power to maneuver them or manipulate those receipts, change the volume of them arbitrarily. It is the work, commodities, goods and things, or the use of properties previously giving up voluntarily for receipts that makes receipts exchangeable for an equivalent worth of work, commodities, tools, machines, or properties of others. Whoever can get receipts without having previously given up an equivalent of what those receipts will command in exchange, actually levies in kind upon the work, goods, properties of all others within this nation. The power to create, that is, originate receipts, is the power to levy in kind, for these new receipts command work, goods, and things. If I could stamp up here and stamp out dollars, all it cost me was the paper and the stamping machine. I could hire all you to work for me endlessly, and all it cost me was I had the power to create the receipts that you're willing to accept. I'd be in pretty much of a position of control over you if I could. Modern money is actually pawn book money. Pawn book money created in 1672 by the goldsmiths to lend to the king constitutes the first item of the present-day national debt of England. In other words, the national debt of England has got bonds outstanding that originated in 1672, that far back. That's almost the beginning of what we know as the modern money system. It did originate in England, and I think most of you probably know something about the story of the goldsmith who issued the multiple receipts. He received gold coins, and it became inconvenient for the people to come and get the gold coins and pay for things with gold coins, so he issued them a receipt. And soon the receipts started to circulate. And he conceived the idea that they didn't come and get the coins, so why can't I issue multiple receipts? So he proceeded to do that. Got up to the point where he'd issued, if he had $1 in gold, he'd issue 10 receipts for $10, and those would circulate, just the same as the original gold would have circulated. And that's the beginning of how this money system started. And people were totally unaware that they were dealing in receipts for gold that he didn't have at all. It didn't exist. But anyway, that's the fundamental underlying principle of the money system today in the United States. Modern money is actually pawn book. Thus in England, the legalized beginning of government bonds was the lending of pawn book money by a private corporation to administrators of government to spend on the war. In other words, to get money to finance a war, they went to the goldsmith, and he issued them tickets. There were nothing but pawn tickets on the gold that he didn't even own. But they circulated as money. So that the national debt began with borrowing from the pawnbroker something he didn't even own, and circulating that as money, and the government itself borrowing those to finance a war. But pawn book money lenders Thus in England, the legalized beginning of government bonds was the lending of pawn book money by private corporations to administrators of government to spend on war. But pawn shop money lenders got perpetual claims on all who acquire receipts, that is, money through work. The national debt in England, as well as in this country, is a mortgage forcing all who earn wages to pay as interest to bondholders a part of the money they earn each year. Besides, the wage earners must repay the principal and the taxes. Bankers who lend what they do not have create new money as loans, or they buy bonds, B-U-I, and other debt paper, or to buy bonds and other debt paper to get private citizens and the United States government into debt to them to claim interest payments, which are a first charge on the new wealth produced by those who must work, or in the direct production of wealth, which is food, clothing, shelter, services, and etc. A debt is a contract to pay a specified number of dollars, that is, receipts, on a specified date. A debt is a mathematical quantity. It does not wear out or become obsolete, as do physical realities. Yet payment of money debts and interest on them requires fixed numbers of dollars, which are demand claims on goods and things and work. The payment of interest and the repayment of the same number of receipts, that is, debts, to bondholders violates the laws of physics and the principles of justice. The payment of interest and repayment of the same number of receipts, that is, debt to bondholders, violates the laws of physics and the principles of justice when, 1, the receipts borrowed were not derived from abstinence, genuine savings on the part of the persons who earned them. Now, if you earn money and save it, you go without spending it yourself, and you save it to buy a government bond, that's one thing. You have earned money in the system. You abstained from spending and you bought yourself a bond. Now, there's nothing immoral or wrong about that, but that is not how most of the bonds come into existence. Most of the federal bonds come into existence in the United States by the Federal Treasury printing up these engraved pieces of paper, issuing them to the banks, and the banks creating a loan on the books of the bank. In other words, they debit government bonds, 10 billion or whatever the sum is that particular time, credit the United States Treasury, 10 billion. It's newly created money that day. And if the government hadn't borrowed that day, the bank deposits would have been 10 billion less than they are at the close of business that day. And you get the distinction between you buying a government bond with your earned money and the government allowing banks to create what they use, what they pay the government. In other words, the government goes to a private institution called the Federal Reserve System. It says, here, we need $5 billion this week. All right? They take in the government paper, which are mortgages on you, to pay the interest and principal, and the banks create the $5 billion, and the government gets a checkbook, and they write the checks, and that increases the money in circulation. Now, the payment of interest and the repayment of the same number of receipts, that is to bondholders, violates the laws of physics and the principles of justice. One, the receipts borrowed were not derived from abstinence on the part of the persons who earned those receipts. Second, the receipts borrowed were spent on futile and useless projects not needed for production, and which did not cause or increase the volume of new goods and things needed in living. See, it's one thing to borrow your earned receipts and use them to expand a factory, or to build a house, or to build some physical thing that's necessary. And it's quite another thing to borrow receipts and use them for war and destroy the things that are acquired with the receipts. The receipts borrowed were spent to acquire goods and things for destruction, that is, war and instruments of war. When the ratio of the totality of receipts, that is, the money in existence, to the totality of everything for sale is not maintained during the duration of the bond contract, and when repayment of the same number of receipts must be made. In other words, if you borrow money, even though you're borrowing for a constructive purpose, and the volume of money is, we'll say, 100 billion, but by the time you're expected you're going to be paid back. I mean, I meant to say, if you lend money, you lend a sum of money that you've earned in savings, by saving. When the total volume of receipts in the country, we'll say, is 100 billion. But you're going to be paid back, we'll say, 25 years later, which is common for a bond to run. But by the time you get your money, there's not 100 billion, there's 200 billion. And yet there hasn't been a proportional increase in the total wealth, physical realities, and in the total production of wealth. So what happens? You're going to get paid back receipts that will not buy anything like the physical things that you could have bought with the money when you loaned it out. So it's the gyrating of the volume of money that has a tremendous effect upon the whole economy. The ratio of the totality of receipts in existence to the totality of everything for sale is not maintained during the duration of the bond contract, and when repayment of the same number of receipts must be made. There are well-defined limits to the possible receipt payments that can be extracted to pay debts, that is, bondholders, and leave a fair share for the wages of workers required to produce the necessities of life and the owners who supply the tools and machines. If too large a proportion of the receipts are paid out to owners of bonds, they can claim too large a portion of the goods and things needed in living, and too little remains for the wage earners and their dependents. At the present time, the 1971, the overall federal, state, municipal, and private debts in the United States aggregate more than the total value of all the physical realities in the country today. Man must first produce, only then can there be what he needs and uses to used up in living. We have accounted for all the receipts in the production system, but there's another claim upon all receipts, and that is taxes. Taxes are paid in receipts. Suppose the government steps in and takes 1/3 of the total receipts earned for work or for the use of tools and machines. That is 1/3 of the profits of industries, the dividends. Each wage earner must then surrender 1 out of each 3 receipts he gets as wages. He can then claim only 2/3 as much food, clothing, and shelter as belonged to him because he worked. The other third goes to persons who did no useful work to make available goods and things needed in living. Now, I'm going to jump over and go to the National Bank Act. I could spend the rest of the week talking about this if I went over the whole everything that I'd like to bring out. But I want to bring out now we turn to again to the money system. The basic provisions of the National Bank Act. The original National Bank Act was passed November the 25th, 1863, but was repealed and reenacted on June the 3rd, 1864. It provided a national currency secured by pledge of United States bonds. Summarized, the Act provided for national chartering of banks and empowered the banks under Section 5202 of the revised statutes to create IOUs. In other words, this pawn book money is nothing but IOUs. Legally, bank deposits are nothing but IOUs. In other words, it's what the bank owes that you are circulating as money. Legally, it's nothing but a promise to pay money, but the promises to pay money are what circulates. In other words, you're using the IOUs of the banks. That's the legal setup. The Act provided for national chartering of banks and empowered banks under Section 5202 of the revised statutes to create IOUs to circulate as money, that is debt money. Each national bank was empowered to create IOUs a fixed number of times the total capital and surplus of the individual bank. Under the original National Bank Act of 1864, banks could not create IOUs as loans to the federal government. They could not at that time create an IOU and lend it to the United States government. That's in the National Bank Act of 1864. You people who have been somewhat familiar with the money system know that previous to that time, Abraham Lincoln had issued the United States notes. When they threatened him with not having money to pay the soldiers, he said, all right. He dusted off the Constitution and said, I'll issue U.S. money. And he did put out $450 million worth of interest-free money, simply had it engraved and paid it out to the soldiers. That money was in circulation in the United States until very recent times, within the last few years. That circulated around and around and around, and it was used by the banks and counted as legal reserves. It was interest-free money paid out under the authority of the sovereign power of the United States. The power to create money is the sovereignty of the country. It's the most important power there is. And when it's delegated, whoever has the power and is exercising it becomes more powerful than the government itself. In other words, becomes the super government that can overpower everything else. Those United States notes have only been very recent times been taken out of circulation. Now, the Civil War was, wait a minute. Each national bank was empowered to create IOUs at a fixed number of times the total capital and surplus of the individual bank. Under the original National Bank Act of 1864, banks could not create IOUs as loans to the federal government. In other words, they could not do deficit financing. Deficit financing means the banks creating what the government spends over and above what they collect in taxes. That's the simple explanation of it. The Civil War was obviously a success from the standpoint of those interested in acquiring billions of interest-bearing claims or bonds against the taxpayers. In 1861, the total funded interest-bearing debt was $68 3/10 billion. By 1867, it was $1,260 million. The extent to which United States Treasury notes were sent abroad can be measured by the fact that by 1869, foreigners, that is London, owned $1.5 billion United States government bonds. In this brief resume, it is impossible to cover more than the highlights. We will now jump to the Federal Reserve Act of December the 23rd, 1913. But before, let me mention that the Gold Standard Act of March 4th, 1900 declared the dollar consisted of 25 8/10 grains of gold, 9/10 fine, be maintained the standard unit of value. Section 2 of the Gold Standard Act authorized the Secretary of the Treasury to exchange the then outstanding bonds of the United States for an equal amount of bonds bearing an interest rate of 2%, the principal and interest payable in gold coin of the standard value. In other words, at that time, there were only about $1 billion, just about $1 billion of United States federal bonds outstanding, and they exchanged those then for these new bonds, which bore 2% and were redeemable in gold coin at a fixed value. This is the first time that the words "the gold coin of the present standard of value" were ever used in a bond contract to the United States government. Now, on December the 23rd, 1913, when about a handful of senators were present in the United States Senate, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Prior to the Federal Reserve Act, all legal reserves of all banks consisted solely of specie or specie certificates, that's gold or gold coins. United States legal tender notes, that's the notes that Lincoln put out at the time of the Civil War, and third, Treasury notes of 1890. A national bank which had taken on as deposits the bank notes of other national banks could deduct the amount of the national bank notes from the total deposits before figuring the deposits against which legal reserves were required. State banks could include in accounting their legal reserves any national bank notes they held in their vaults. In other words, prior to the Federal Reserve Act, there was no centralized control. Nobody could have a meeting and decide, now we're going to collapse the whole money system, or now we're going to expand the whole money system. It was pretty well diversified. I mean, there was some power to do that, but nothing like what they got when they got a central banking system, whereby the controllers of those 12 central banks could cause a vast expansion or could cause a vast contraction. In a national bank which had taken in as deposits the banknotes of other national banks could deduct the amount of the national banknotes from their total deposits before figuring the deposits against which legal reserves were required. State banks could include in accounting their legal reserves any national banknote they held in their vaults. One bank could build legal reserves on the books of another bank only by actually depositing coins or lawful money as above designated. The Federal Reserve Act instituted for the first time in the United States the practice of one type of bank actually creating pawn book money that could be counted by other banks as legal reserves. In other words, the 12 central banks could create these loans, in other words, pawn book money, and those loans became the legal reserves of the local banks, the domestic banks all over the country. The Federal Reserve Act set up 12 central banks and required each national bank to subscribe to the capital stock of the 12 central bank, to the central bank in its district, a sum equal to 6% of its capital and surplus. 3% had to be paid in gold or gold certificates. State banks could purchase stock in the central bank if they chose. Banks owning stock in the central banks were required to keep their legal reserves, other than their till money, as deposits on the books of the Federal Reserve Bank. Each member could obtain Federal Reserve Bank notes from the Federal Reserve Bank in its district by instructing it to send Federal Reserve currency and deduct the amount from its deposits on the books of the Federal Reserve Bank. The U.S. Treasury paid for the engraving of the currency. The Federal Reserve banks were empowered to create pawn book money, one, to lend to the member banks. In other words, if a bank needed reserves, all they needed to do was go and borrow from the central bank, and the central bank would create what it loaned to the local bank. To buy from member banks or other private entities, government bonds, notes, or eligible commercial paper. In other words, if a manufacturing company had borrowed from a local bank and had given its note, the bank could take that note of that local manufacturer to the central bank, and the central bank would create money to add to their reserves and lend to the local bank. So it was a concertina within a concertina. The power of member banks to be indebted is defined in Section 5136 of the Revised Statutes of the United States, and Section 5202 of the Revised Statutes was increased. Section 13 empowered a member bank to accept drafts or bills of exchange drawn upon it and involving the importation or exportation of goods having not more than 6 months' sight to run. But no bank could accept such bills to an amount equal at any time in the aggregate to more than 1/2 of its paid-up capital stock and surplus. Before 1917, when Congress declared war, heavy exports sent from the United States to Europe were paid for through the creation of pawn book money by the Federal Reserve banks and the member and non-member banks. Just as the Federal Reserve System was put into operation, World War I opened in the summer of 1914. A tremendous expansion of the volume of pawn book money in circulation took place between 1915 and 1920 to buy and lend international acceptances. On March 27, 1917, the Federal Reserve Bank took in 50 million 2% Treasury certificates of indebtedness and created pawn book money to lend to the United States Treasury. There are those 2% bonds I spoke of a few minutes ago. They were pawned at the Federal Reserve banks to expand the reserves. And of these 50 million, 20 million was taken by the New York Federal Reserve Bank. When the Treasury paid out checks drawn against these Federal Reserve banks, these checks were deposited in the member banks. Thus, member banks' reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank were increased. Thus, for the first time since the passage of the National Bank Act in 1864, the United States notes or certificates of indebtedness were taken in directly from the Treasury by Federal Reserve banks, and pawn book money was created to lend to the United States Treasury. On April the 6th, 1917, the United States Congress declared war on Germany. On April the 24th, 1917, Congress authorized the Secretary of the Treasury to borrow $5 billion. Of this sum, such sum or sums as in his judgment may be necessary could be borrowed to the issuance of certificates of indebtedness at par, the amount of outstanding at any one time not to exceed $2 billion. Then under four authorities, and this is all in very fine print in the legislation, April 24th, 1917, September 24th, April 4th, 1918, March 3rd, 1919, the interest-bearing debt owed by USA taxpayers was increased from $1,282,000,000 on April the 5th, 1917 to $25 billion, 25 and 5/10 billions. The maximum was reached on April the 31st, April 30th, 1919. In other words, the banks had created for the federal government to spend a little over $24 billion. But in today's arithmetic, that would be very modest, but that's what they expanded during the World War I. That is new money created because the government gave them government bonds and they created the new money. As the system was expanded more and more, the public was urged to buy Liberty bonds with their earnings. Borrow and buy campaign was carried on. As the certificates of indebtedness matured, the banks exchanged the matured certificates for long-term bonds. Every time the government spent money it had not collected in taxes, there was to be an interest-bearing government bond left for the taxpayers to pay. Thus, we see the total government spent was what the government spent was obtained from the banks through the creation of new pawn book money from persons who bought bonds without earned money, and from tax collections. Now, there were 6 great periods. First, from 1915 to 1920 was a big expansion. We went from total deposits, that is debt circulating as money. We went from 15 billion to 35 billion. Then they pulled it back from 35.5 billion to 33.5 billion. That was from 20 to 22. Then they put it up from 33 and 3/10 billions to 46 billion. That was in 22 to 29. And in the meantime, they changed a lot of the basic rules for what purposes the banks could create money. In other words, they weakened the structure very much and made it possible for the banks to create money. For example, under the McFadden Act of 1927, they could take in most anything and create money against it. And that caused this big expansion in 1929 in the stock market. But in the same time, they were curtailing the country banks, undermining the basic structure of the farming community. And while banks were closing all during the 20s, good banks, I mean banks that had been well managed and well run, they were not run by men who were out to destroy the country at all, but they were under such pressure, and they were forced to buy international bonds, which later became worthless. The whole thing was to undermine the basic structure of the United States. And now everybody in this room probably remembers when they curtailed the money from 46 billion down to a little over 31 billion between 1929 and 1933. In the meantime, 10,000 banks in the United States had failed. And many of them had been run by very honorable men. They were not out to destroy, but they were the victims of the centralized control. And the control of even the big metropolitan banks changed hands. I mean, who was controlling them changed. Then from 1933 to 40, they expanded the money system from 31 and 7/10 billions up to almost 44 billions. But that was very modest. At that time, we still maintained, see, we still hadn't gotten back to where we were in 29. That is, even from 33 to 40, we still hadn't gotten back up to the total volume of money in existence that we had on June 30th, 29. Then from 40 to 45, they expanded it from 43.5 billion to 104 billion. That's during the Second World War period. Now, from 40 to 71, it's gone from 104 billion to 225 billion. So that's the total volume of what we use for money in existence today. That's the currency and the checkbook money that we circulate. 225 billion. That's the reason your cost of living is rising all the time. The volume of money is being expanded way out of proportion to the volume necessary to carry on the production within the country. Now, the Bretton Woods. In 1944, they held a convention at what was called Bretton Woods. The reason for naming it Bretton Woods was to take the word money out of it. People wouldn't know what they're talking about when they were talking about the Bretton Woods meeting. They thought it was some picnic or something of that kind. And they had things going. I testify, if I divert for just a minute. I went down to testify before the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, and I was down there 5 weeks altogether. It was 3 weeks before I got really to the assignment to testify. And in the meantime, I used to go in and listen to some of the testimony. And one day, they had a Mrs. Strauss. She was head of the League of Women Voters. And Jessie Sumner was then a congresswoman from Illinois, and Jessie was on the House Committee, the Banking and Currency Committee. And Mrs. Strauss was in favor of the Bretton Woods very much. So Jessie said to her, "Now, Mrs. Strauss, that Bretton Woods agreement is very, very hard to understand, very difficult." And she held the thing up. And it was written in crypto language of the worst kind. You'd had to have a long background to be able to interpret what they were talking about at all. And the chief advisor to both the House and the Senate was a man named Harry Dexter White. He represented the Treasury. He had a high position in the Treasury, and he was the expert. Whenever a question would come up, that he was supposed to elucidate this for both the House and the Congress. And if there was a confusion artist, he was it. So anyway, Mrs. Strauss came on with her testimony representing the League of Women Voters. And Jessie said to her, "Now, Mrs. Strauss, I find this Bretton Woods agreement very, very difficult to understand, even though some of my family have been in the banking business back in Illinois for a number of years. I find it very difficult. How do you know that the women of the League of Women Voters are for this?" She was for it, of course. "Well," she said, we have determined that." She says, "How did you determine it?" "Well," she said, for example, how did you find out that the women down in my territory, my district, want this Bretton Woods agreement enforced or put into motion, and put into law?" "Well," she said, "we had local meetings of the League of Women Voters." "Well," Jessie said, "when did you have those local meetings at which you discussed this?" So she pinned her down to some time. Then she said, "Well, now, how did you know, after you found out what they wanted in my district, these women, then where did you go from that?" "Oh, then," she said, "we had district meetings." "Well," she said, "when were the district meetings held?" Well, she kept at her until she had to give her some dates. "Well, then what did you do?" "Well, then we had a statewide meeting." Well, Jessie said, "When were those meetings? I want some positive dates of when you had those meetings, that you determined that the women wanted this Bretton Woods enactment, this law, put into law." Well, she kept at her until she made her give her some dates. Then she said, "Now, when did they decide that you should come down here and testify for the whole League of Women Voters nationwide?" Well, we had then a nationwide meeting. Well, Jessie said, "Just when did those meetings take place? I want to get the dates on these things." So she finally pinned her down to those. She said, "Now, Mrs. Stott, it's very, very funny. I am a member of the Banking and Currency Committee of the House and have been all through this time. And yet I didn't have any access to any of the Bretton Woods papers until long after the dates that you mentioned, when the women down in my district were able to decide this." It was strictly hokum, that's all. They had witness after witness that came in and testified. What they actually did in the Bretton Woods Agreement, they created a fund, and they created they created two things, a fund and an international bank. Congress actually conveyed, under the same language as in the National Banking Act, they conveyed the power to create dollars to both the fund and the bank, both of them. In other words, they were giving away the sovereign power of the United States of America to the administrators of the Bretton Woods Agreement, with Harry Dexter White as the chief exponent and who was supposed to explain all this to the members of Congress. Even Senator Taft did not understand what was in that bill. He was the chairman of the Senate Banking Currency Committee of the United States Senate. Now we have reached a state today where you're hearing all the time about the balance of payments. As you know, we've had these men in many fronts, soldiers, and we have also, not only Vietnam but other places, we also have had thousands of skilled workmen that the United States government is paying, building things, installations in various parts of the world, all at the expense of the American taxpayer. So how in the world have they been able to pay these bills? They've paid it to the expansion of the money system internationally. Now the euro dollars that you read about in the papers are nothing but the dollars created by branch banks, banks of the big metropolitan banks operating in European countries, big cities in Europe, create dollars on their books, and those dollars flow just like the dollars flow between cities in the United States. And the Treasury itself is issuing Treasury bonds, Treasury notes, to the Bank for International Settlements. The Bank for International Settlements, when this money flows out, flows into the central banks of Europe, the big central banks of Europe, like the Reichsbank, the Bank of England. And when that flows out, it becomes the reserves of the local banks in all of those European countries. In other words, they are levying upon the people of the United States via expanding our money system in an international sphere to pay what they are spending over and above what they're extracting from you in taxes for these installations in various parts of the world. Now, do you understand why the war goes on and on and on? It's the excuse for having our men over there so they can continue to spend the money. And what we're really doing is doing two things: destroying the cultures of those countries and at the same time taking over economic power over those people via the misuse of the American money system and via the creation of euro dollars in Europe. Now, they apparently, according to their plans back in '44, they got another 100 billion to go. We've only got 400 billion outstanding now. So they've estimated back as far as '44 that they'd go for 500 billion. So we've got quite a ways to go yet. For that reason, I think we're going to continue the inflation as far into the future as we can see at the present moment. And we'll continue some kind of excuse for spending money all over the world. But the excuse is to build modern installations for the benefit of the people that are going to take over those countries, not the decent citizens, not the people who live there, not the people who belong there, due to that's their home, but those bureaucrats who moved in and taken over control. In other words, it's the power and the prestige of the United States that is imposing world totalitarianism on the world. We're the ones doing it. But the power of the United States money and the United States skills and knowledge, our skills. The United States had the greatest development of technical skills, patents of all kinds, trained men, highly skilled men, and all of that is being used to impose totalitarianism and atheism upon these other countries of the world, upon which were countries with a Christian culture and wanted no part of the destruction of their culture, not at all. This thing is a cold-blooded economic proposition, using the American boy, the soldier, and the skilled workman that's over there, and the American citizen inflating his money and taxing him and forcing us to be the power that puts communism on, socialism or whatever you want to call it, over on the whole world. In other words, we are destroying our own Christian culture at home by all these things I enumerated, and destroying the Christian culture of Europe, all under the pretext of stopping communism. So you see what our position is and what our problem is, and why we are getting so much resentment from other parts of the world. the Bretton Woods enabling legislation enable them to extend the use of the sovereign power of the United States to every country in the world. In other words, levy on you to do what they want to do in all these foreign countries via the use of the money system of the United States. I personally think that when they get through with this inflation, and we're going farther with the inflation, they're going to try to put the whole world into one money system. And I think the money system then, they will try to base it on gold. They'll probably put all the gold in the world in one pot, and then adjust the currency ratios. Now, I didn't get into that because the subject's so vast, but when you get a foreign money, you're simply swapping your money for the money of the other country. That's what foreign exchange is. Now, at the present time, our price structure is way out of line. It's too high. We've got these wage rates in certain industries that are way out of line with similar wage rates in other parts of the world, so that we're practically excluded from the export market. Someday they're going to have to readjust that. In other words, put them more in line. But I don't think it will happen until you've gone much farther with inflation in this country, and then the attempt to set up a world money system with all the gold in one place in a world bank, and then the currency ratios adjusted in accord with the price structures of those countries at that time. That is, if the United States government and its citizens stand hedged and allow this socialism to be put over on us, or communism, or whatever you want to call it. But in the meantime, you are destroying underneath the very fabric of the whole Christian civilization. I think I've said it. I don't know whether I put it over or not.
Thank you very much, Ms. Coogan. I consider Gertrude Coogan one of the greatest authorities in the whole world on money.